Hi, everyone, and welcome to this week's Awareness Wednesday. I am delighted to be joined today by Wendy Yared from Evolve.ag. She's going to give us some of her food industry insights. She's a food anthropologist, which sounds like a cool job, and then she's had Evolve going for a little over a year now. Is that right, Wendy?
That's right. Thanks so much, Taylor. I'm
Yeah.
so excited to be on Awareness Wednesday with you. This is going to be so fun.
Yes. So, Wendy, we're going to let you take it away. And as you're watching, feel free to type your questions or comments into the comment screen. We'll see them. And then Wendy will try to respond to them as we go. So, take it away, Wendy.
All right. Sounds great. I'm going to just share my screen. All right. Here we go. Does that look right, Taylor? Okay, cool. All right. Well, thanks everybody so much. Especially thank you so much to you, Taylor, for inviting me on to Awareness Wednesday. I'm really excited to chat with you all a little bit about food myths and marketing. As Taylor said, I am a food anthropologist. I am a food anthropologist, and I'm also the founder of Evolve.ag. As a food anthropologist, I study the way that people and food interact. So not necessarily everything that you're eating and how that's affecting you from a nutritional standpoint, but more of a societal and cultural point of view. Not only am I working on Evolve.ag, but I was recently tapped to be a senior advisor at a venture fund called Align. And Align is they're funding companies that are very much focused on natural and nature and other things that are very environmentally friendly. So I'm sure you guys will hear about them as they kind of kick off and get started a little bit. My background is at Google. I spent 6 years doing learning experience design there. I also have a master's in applied anthropology, and I love gardening and I love cooking. So all kinds of wraps up into my food anthropology as well. When I was in grad school, I explored the intersections of food, culture, and identity, especially as it related to Pacific Islanders in San Diego. And it really looked at why, Spam and rice is considered a cultural, traditional food amongst that population when it was introduced during World War II. So anyways, that's a little bit about me. And now a little bit about Evolve.ag. So I started Evolve.ag about a year ago as a way for me to be able to communicate to people about what's going on with food, and really help people understand what they're putting in their bodies. So there's always going to be hot new trends like kale or cauliflower, or even keto, right? But there's also a ton of innovation happening with food and how it's being produced and how it's being distributed. So all of a sudden, we're seeing experiments where meat is being produced in a lab. Technologies like CRISPR are in existence, and these guys are applying gene editing technology to seeds. And indoor vertical farms are sprouting up all over the country, in fact, all over the world, in fact, to make food more local and easier to obtain. I think all of this progress in the food industry is really, really great. And there's always going to be pros and cons. So I really wanted to have a platform to be able to break down what these new technologies are and share, the good, the bad, the ugly, and their potential. Ultimately, we have a growing population, and we need to have new solutions to feed everybody and to be able to have a more equitable food system. And it's finally starting to happen. So that's what I've been researching and talking about over the past year on Evolve.ag. If you go to the website, it's Evolve.ag, and you'll see a lot of long form content, as well as I just started a podcast this year. So check it out and subscribe to our newsletter and check out the podcast on any platforms where you normally would listen to a podcast. So today, I'm going to talk you through some of the larger issues that I've been seeing within the consumer food industry. And hopefully you'll walk away with some tips that will help you feel a little bit more confident about what you're buying and that it's good for you and that it's good for the planet. One of the things I've noticed, and you've probably heard about too, is that there's a ton of misinformation about food out there. There's a lot of marketing dollars being spent on this misinformation, and a lot of it is promoting these new trendy foods or drinks as healthy or clean or natural or otherwise good for you. And it's not always true. Even the word organic is misused quite a bit. There's a lot of mislabeling and a lot of misuse of the term. So today I'm going to unpack that, talk a little bit about trends, talk a little bit about the organic label, and also share with you some recent insights that I've had about the plastic food industry. A lot of people are switching from plastic to paper and to cardboard and other kind of renewables. And I want to talk a little bit about that as well, as far as it comes to how your food gets to you, or how you're, what you're eating your food out of. So those are the 3 topics we'll be going over today. All right, so let's kick it off by looking at some of the trendy foods that are out there. So we've got kale. This is, now a superfood. We've got cauliflower, which is kale's cousin, basically, suddenly showing up in everything from pizza crust to smoothies. And then we've also got some meat replacements, some plant-based burgers that are showing up all over the world. But are these new foods fads, or are they actually good for you? Well, the answer is sometimes. So let's look at kale first. Kale, for example, is an excellent source of vitamins. So you can get vitamins A, vitamin C, K, vitamins B6. It has a ton of calcium and potassium and manganese in it. But kale is also, it contains a heavy metal called thallium that sucks up from the soil. And if you eat too much kale, it can cause fatigue, it can cause brain fog, and even cause digestive problems. And the problem is that one of the most popular ways to eat kale is actually by drinking it in a smoothie. And people tend to use a lot of kale in these smoothies. A lot of times they'll put 6 or 7 leaves in there and juice it on up, which makes it taste really good and really kale-y. But it's probably a lot more than you would eat if you were just having kale as a side dish, right? So you can imagine that by eating a salad with that much kale, you might get really full afterwards. And with juicing it, you don't get as much fullness, but you still get all of those nutrients, both the good ones and the bad ones. So it's just something to keep in mind. Be careful about the amount of things that you're eating, especially when you're eating these new trendy foods. Cauliflower is another one. Cauliflower is a distant cousin of kale. It's in the brassica family. And similarly, it sucks up heavy metals from the ground. So take caution, see how your body feels after you eat it, and then try to do it in moderation. Try not to replace an entire giant bowl of rice with a giant bowl of cauliflower rice right away. See what happens when you eat that and see how you feel afterwards. Maybe do a little half and half, but try not to go overboard with these new trends right away until you see how your body feels. Okay, what about these plant-based meat alternatives like the Beyond Meat or the Impossible Burger? Are these things actually healthier for you? Well, again, it's a little bit complicated. If you compare the nutrient content between an Impossible Burger and a comparable amount of ground beef, the only real difference in nutrients is in the cholesterol levels. So the plant-based meat alternatives have way less cholesterol than, let's say, a comparable amount of ground beef. But otherwise, there's really not a ton of difference. The calorie count's about the same, the other nutrients are about the same, and there's actually probably some ingredients in the Impossible Burger, the Beyond Meat stuff that you might not even recognize or be able to pronounce. So it's up to you whether you want to try these things. I definitely would recommend testing them out and seeing how you feel. But again, see how your body feels, and don't go overboard. Don't eat 10 of these a week where you would normally just eat 1 burger a week. The other thing, though, I should mention is that plant-based burgers are superior if you're thinking about the environmental impact. It takes a lot less carbon to grow an Impossible patty than it does to grow a cow. So if you're looking beyond nutrition, there's definitely other reasons to try out these burgers and include them in your diet. But, as I said, just don't go overboard. Don't eat too much, and don't think that they are, a savior food just because everybody's talking about them and thinks they're so great. They're delicious, they are healthy, but like everything else, just try them in moderation. So just to recap, don't go overboard with food trends, and eat a little bit and then see how your body reacts. Okay. Oh, Taylor, I see you talking.
I was talking and then I muted myself.
Oh, okay.
I have a question.
Yeah.
I've been thinking about, first of all, I did not know that kale and cauliflower were related. But is getting the heavy metals from the soil, is that something that's specific to that family of vegetable, or is that something that's in all greens that people need to be aware of? I ask personally because I'm a spinach in my smoothie person over a kale in my smoothie person.
It just depends on the soil really, like, and where the soil is being grown. Certain plants suck up more nutrients than others. If you look at, for example, like the root ball of a cauliflower plant, it's going to be really, really big, right? Whereas like it's huge versus the root ball of a spinach plant is going to be a little bit smaller just because, spinach produces leaves and just the way that it's grown. So I don't know all of the specifics, but I would imagine just because it's got a smaller root system to it, it's going to not get as much of those heavy metals than stuff in the brassica family would.
Thank you.
Of course. All right, so let's move on to the next controversial territory, which is organic. Is organic food better for you than conventionally grown food? Well, let me give you a little history before we get into this. So back in the day, all farms were organic, right? People used natural methods to grow their foods because we didn't have pesticides. People shared seeds, people self-propagated different types of plants to suit their needs and suit their environments. But sometimes, there wasn't enough food. It was one of the big critiques of, farming, to be honest, and so synthetic pesticides in agriculture were adopted because they started resulting in larger yields. That's one of the reasons why they were adopted. There's a lot of different reasons why pesticides came into the picture, but it resulted in larger yields and people were happy. Since their adoption, global food security has increased, which is a great thing, right? Without conventionally grown food, most people think that we would have food scarcity on the earth and we would not be able to feed the growing worldwide populations. But consider this. That we as a species waste at least 25% of our food. Sometimes it goes bad before it gets to the market, Sometimes people don't eat it because it's just not right. And in the US, this number is actually estimated to be 40%. 40% of food is wasted here in the US. So while, growing organic might cause food scarcity, we're already wasting so much that perhaps there would actually be less of a threat of food insecurity if we all switched to organic and we're a little bit more mindful about our foods. So anyways, that's just a little bit of history and some food for thought. Let's get into the actual question here. Is organic food healthier, more sustainable, and better for the planet than conventionally grown food? Well, the answer is, as you probably guessed, it depends. So first off, when you think of an organic farm, what comes to your mind? In general, the idea of organic food is that it's grown as naturally as possible without using pesticides or synthetic chemicals. And a lot of people picture organic food being grown on small-scale farms that don't monocrop and instead plant a variety of different fruits and vegetables together, thus helping keep the soil and the broader ecosystem healthy. If I can find my mouse, you might have a picture like this in mind. But in reality, organic farming might look more like this. The actual definition of organic doesn't necessarily always line up with this idyllic picture that we have in our minds. And as far as regulations go, every government around the world has a different definition of organic. Some are less strict than others, some are more strict than others. In the US, for example, the USDA defines organic food as an agricultural product that's not subjected to synthetic chemicals or prohibited substances. But there are over 60 exceptions to substances that are allowed, that are synthetic or, in the prohibited category. So a lot of these are things that we would use in everyday life and wouldn't think twice about. So ethanol alcohol is on that list of synthetic chemicals. Hydrogen peroxide is also on that list. But there's also things such as xylazine, which is a horse tranquilizer, and copper, which is a heavy metal and can have detrimental effects on human health and microorganism health. The USDA also has exceptions for non-organic ingredients like gums or gelatin or food colorings, and these things are allowed to be added to foods that are labeled as organic even if they're not. So food labeling can be a little misleading. In the US, also, something can be labeled as made with organic if they only contain 70% organically produced materials. So something to consider. In the EU, for example, guidelines for organic are a little bit more strict, and they actually go beyond the plants and the food themselves and include land management practices too. They have a complete ban on GMOs, and they really have focused on soil health as one of the components that, one of the requirements rather, to make a farm organic. So just keep in mind, the term organic means different things in different places, and it might not always translate to that idyllic picture that you have of a farm. But before we move on, one more tip that I should mention is that there's a new buzzword happening in farming these days. It's not really new, but it's kind of getting a lot of attention, and that's called regenerative farming. Now, these folks are probably a little bit closer to that picture on the left. They're the ones that are taking a more conservation-based and environmental approach to farming. They specifically are working on soil diversity, keeping biodiversity on their farm. So instead of just killing pests, they'll introduce other animals that, you know, kind of work in this whole ecosystem way. And they also really focus on improving the water around their farm. So keep an ear out for regenerative farming. These guys, like I said, are doing really great, and it's starting to become a buzzword in the agriculture industry. But they're probably as close as you can get to farms that are doing the most good.
So when I first saw that slide, uh, I really thought you were going to tell us that the one on the left is an organic farm and the one on the right was a conventional farm. Like 100%. So, and I see your next slide. I was going to ask a question about pesticides, like natural pesticides. So stop me if you're getting to some of this. I'm going to hold that question. But another term I see frequently is natural. Can you speak a little bit to like what, I know some of the labeling gets really political. And so what does it mean if something is labeled organic versus natural?
Natural doesn't mean anything. I mean, okay, for all of this, let me just say, you know, take what I'm saying with a grain of salt. Not everybody is trying to game the system. Not all of the marketing is lies, but sometimes it is a lie. And sometimes people stretch the truth, and, you know, it could be called natural, and maybe it is natural in their mind in a certain, you know, set of circumstances. But in general, I would ignore, if you're using the word natural to make a decision, like, oh, I should spend $2 extra for this natural peanut butter versus like the unnatural peanut butter, you know, I would look at other things like nutrition content or ingredients, not necessarily what it's labeled as natural. Okay, cool. So yeah, let's get into pesticides, because this one's a really interesting one. And probably the most important component of it in my point of view. So for organic farming, you know, does the food from organic farms contain more or less pesticides? Are there more or less nutrients? Is the food better for you, if you will, when you buy it organically? You know, that's, I think, what a lot of people think, because it costs more and it's got this great label on it. But is it actually true? Well, from a nutrient standpoint, yes, actually, it is true. Studies have shown that there are more antioxidants in organically grown food and less harmful metals. But it's not a huge difference, and these vary from plant to plant. But from a chemical standpoint, the results actually are significant. So the USDA tests foods for chemical levels, and in a recent study, they found that conventional food had over 300% more chemical residues than organic foods. But keep in mind, like all data, this data also has limitations too, because the USDA doesn't actually test all of the chemicals that the organic farmers are using. So it's not quite an apples to apples comparison, but if you're worried about chemical levels, it's definitely smart to opt for organic. It's definitely always going to be lower. But if you wash and you cook your vegetables or your food, that also helps remove the chemical residues too. So it doesn't do like 100% get rid of them, but it will help lower that chemical residue that you find on there. But in general, organic does have that as a benefit. It definitely has less pesticides. The other thing, though, to keep in mind is that even organic farmers still use, you know, natural sprays and natural pesticides, and these can cause harm to an ecosystem. So natural compounds like manure or compost also will contain heavy metals sometimes. They can contain hormones, and they can contain antibiotics as well. And those things will leach into the soil, and then, you know, the plants will take those up into their root systems as well. And some of these hormones, antibiotics, and heavy metals are even considered slightly toxic by the EPA if taken in high doses. So it really depends on how the farmers are, taking care of their soil, what they're putting into it, which is how, which will be how the plants result in, a healthier or more heavy metal focused plant. Another example of, a natural pesticide, if you will, is called diatomaceous earth. And this is a white powder that you can sprinkle on your plants that will kill like annoying bugs like aphids and whitefly. But the problem with this is that it's indiscriminate. So once you apply it to a plant, it also can kill beneficial insects and the pollinators too. So just because something's called natural or is a natural pesticide doesn't necessarily mean it's always better for the plant or that it's safer for the whole ecosystem in general. But
So we were talking before several weeks ago. You turned me on to oat milk because of like bee murder in relation to almond milk. Is that to do with the pesticides?
So there's a couple of issues with almonds right now. Yeah, I mean, pesticides are definitely a problem. It's also because almond trees tend to be monocropped. And so there's not like a place for bees to go and rejuvenate after their long day of work. Like they go back to their hive and whatnot, but there's not a diversity of other plant species. So they don't quite get like the type of beneficial environment like that, after a hard day of work, you want to go to the spa, right? Or like you want to go home and put your feet up. They just go home and then they go out the next day and it's the whole, same routine and it's really hard. And there's not, like I said, because there's not a lot of other biodiversity, it tends to deplete them.
So is that similar to like monocropping and the effects on the soil, where if you plant the same crop over and over again, it depletes the soil? It does the same thing to pollinators?
Exactly. And they even said too that there are, they did experiments with almond groves that have other plants in there, or like a more diverse farm that has a couple of almond trees and other things too. And that when the bees go to these more diverse places, they do really well. Like you don't lose as many bees. They grow in size rather than deplete the numbers too. So yeah, monocropping is just, not the best. It's beneficial in some cases, but for the most part, we need to move away from that.
Yeah. And it sounds like in thinking about chemicals in general, like chemical has kind of become a dirty word in a way. And I think that's something that like I didn't understand before, in that there are natural chemicals, obviously. And so trying to be chemical free, like there's good chemicals and there's bad chemicals, and there's natural chemicals and there's synthetic chemicals. So there's just a whole lot more that goes into this in the marketing and the words that are used than I think a lot of us are really thinking about day to day. I know I'm super susceptible to the marketing, so I'm glad we're having this conversation.
Yeah. I mean, it's really just about making people more aware, right? And farmers have to do what they have to do sometimes, right? It's not like farmers like, oh yeah, I want to kill everything, so let me sprinkle diatomaceous earth all over. It's like, no, like we're having an outbreak of aphids and my entire crops are going to fail if I don't fix this problem, so it's a fine line. And natural chemicals are much better than the synthetic ones, right? At least they break down quicker, they break down naturally, right? It's more of being part of an ecosystem than things that are more synthetic that take forever to break down or maybe don't or spread to other farms in the wind. So there's a lot of there's a lot more pros to organic farming, even if there are loopholes. Cool. All right. On to the next topic. So greenhouse gases is definitely something we've been hearing a lot about globally, right? We all know that carbon levels keep increasing and that they're likely, they're definitely causing some global warming around here. And farms do emit greenhouse gases. So we've got carbon, methane, and nitrous oxide are the big ones that are emitted from farming. In the US, the EPA reported that agriculture and forestry accounts for about 9% of greenhouse gas emissions. So What about organic farms? Do they produce less greenhouse gases? Are they better for the environment? Well, the answer is yes, most of the time again. There's always going to be some exceptions, and it really depends on the methods that are used by the farmer. So remember from our history lesson earlier that organic farming is great, but it yields less than conventional farming. So you might actually need to use more land than in conventional farming to get the same amount of food at the end of the day. But the good thing about proper organic farming is that it does help offset carbon by trapping it in the soil and releasing it much slower than with conventional farming. So from a greenhouse gas perspective, it is superior versus conventional farming. Another thing, though, to note is that organic farming is not exclusively being done by small-scale producers. And research has noted that when large farming companies, or big ag, as we lovingly call them in the industry, participate in organic farming, the emissions in these growing methods are sometimes higher because they're actually using a ton of heavy machinery and they're getting a lower yield than they would by growing conventionally. And I think that big ag is only going to keep being part of the organic industry. It's really good for their bottom line because organic food is a little bit more expensive. And they're also a big part of the supply chain. So for example, let's say Frito-Lay wants to create an organic potato chip. So the potatoes have to be organic, the sunflower seeds that they make the sunflower oil from have to be organic, the soybeans and the corn, all of these things have to be grown organically for the final product to be called organic. And companies in big ag have the scale to be able to do this. They can produce mass quantities of these ingredients without driving up the price too much. So while these economies of scale from big ag tend to threaten smaller producers, and they can pollute the environment a little bit more, the good thing about them joining the supply chain is that it should lead to more supply and thus start helping drive down the cost of organic food. So organic produced by big ag can be a little bit more affordable for everybody. Like I said, there's pros and cons, especially when it comes to greenhouse gases that they're emitting. But at the end of the day, they are helping in one sense to help reduce the price. This slide I just wanted to include because it's one of the best infographics that I've seen about how much greenhouse gases are emitted across the food supply industry. So everywhere from land use all the way to being packaged and sold. It shows the different amounts of greenhouse gas emitted in each stage. So I'm not going to get into it for time's sake, but the source is down at the bottom, visualcapitalist.com. And they cite all their references too. They just put the infographic together. And I would encourage you to take a look at this because it's really one of the best infographics I've seen. And it really shows you how some of your favorite foods are produced and the emissions that are associated with them. So have a look on your own time. And then we're going to move into the juicy part. Okay, last but not least, when it comes to organic, there have been a lot of scandals happening. Reports have shown that there are corruption and controversy with the people that actually certify organic farms. So these guys are called the certifying agents. And these guys go out and inspect organic farms and give the organic certifications to folks. In these cases, and in this research that's been done, it's been noted that the certifiers were incentivized by profit and corporate influence. And this is somewhat easy to imagine because the certifiers are actually getting paid by the farms that they monitor. And that leaves a lot of room for kind of backroom conversations or off the record conversations, et cetera, et cetera. One example of this was uncovered by the Washington Post a couple years ago about Aurora Dairy. Now, Aurora Dairy supplies milk to some of the biggest providers in the country, like Walmart and Costco. And in general, with cows that produce organic milk are supposed to be allowed to graze every day throughout the growing season. However, the reporters from the Post monitored the herds and they took aerial photographs too during the growing season. And these photographs proved that the cows were actually not going out to pasture every day. This issue was brought up to the certifying agents, and the certifying agents had nothing to say because they had scheduled their inspections after the grazing season was over, after the growing season was over. So yeah, there's always a little bit of backhand stuff going on sometimes with, especially when you get to these bigger economies of scale. Now, not always, but sometimes. If you read my newsletter a couple of weeks ago, there was an example of a farm scandal article that I shared that was this crazy story about a grain farmer in Missouri. Now, this guy claimed he was selling organic grains, including organic feed for animals, and he was grossing millions of dollars in revenue. But in fact, it turns out he didn't have enough organic acres to actually do this. And eventually he was found out by the authorities. Now, there's also a bit of a dramatic side story about him leading a double life in Vegas. And unfortunately, the story doesn't end well. So I'm going to stop the gossiping there. But if you want to read that article, I'm happy to send it to you, because it just goes to show that, sometimes there is corruption, and sometimes people are not always thinking of, they're thinking of their bottom line and not being transparent. And it's not just us. There's stuff happening around the world too. There is a report that came out of the Netherlands last year that analyzed inspection reports from the only Dutch company that's allowed to certify foods in the Netherlands as organic. And that report stated that over 10% of the farms actually didn't meet the EU organic standards for organic, but the companies were still allowed to sell their products as organic. So it's not just us. There's other people doing it too. And like I said, in general, most people are actually doing things the right way, but there's always going to be, well, maybe not always. I would hope not always, but right now there's always a little bit of like corruption going on. So things are not always what they seem all the time. And I hope this doesn't make you frustrated or sad, because, it's not all bad news, and not everybody's trying to game the system. In fact, most people aren't. The goal of this presentation was just to bring some of this to your attention so that you're a little bit more informed. But there are plenty of farmers who follow the regulations and dedicate their lives to organic practices. It's just not always a perfect system. So what can you do? All right. Here's a couple of things that I would suggest. So that way you can just be more proactive and make sure that what you're buying, you're spending extra money on if you're buying organic, is actually up to par. And the first and foremost thing is to buy organic from trusted farmers. Find out where your food is coming from. I know this probably sounds weird, but you're not going to be the first person in the grocery store asking these types of questions, or going to a farmer's market and asking these types of questions. If it's not clear where the meat or produce is coming from, then just ask. Or if it's labeled with a specific farm name, Google that farm, call that farm, or go visit that farm even. Talk to the producers who are making your food. I've actually found here in California that a lot of farms can't afford the organic certification, but they're still using organic practices. So sometimes you can even get organically grown food, even when it's not labeled as such. And in these cases, it's sometimes cheaper. Another thing you can do is just wash your food every time. And if you're worried about chemical residues, cook it. And then lastly, look for farms that are practicing regenerative agriculture. Like I said, if you keep an eye out for this word, I bet you'll start hearing it more and more. And in my opinion, these are the farms that are doing the most good and really giving back to the environment and trying to keep things, biodiverse and happy. And also, it's not just farms that are doing this, but a lot of wineries are going in this direction too. So, keep an eye out for regenerative ag wine too. So those are some solutions. Taylor, did you have any other questions before we get into the packaging section?
Yeah, in thinking about finding regenerative agriculture, is there a source, is there a place people can go and look up where to find those locally, or is it kind of too new right now?
I would just Google it. I would say,
okay.
Yeah, regenerative agriculture dialects and see what comes up.
All right, guys, if I find something, I'll post it.
Yeah, definitely. All right. Okay, so the last topic I want to talk about is food packaging. Basically, when you buy food, it's got to get to you somehow, right? And so there's definitely an amount of packaging, even if it's just you putting it in a bag and taking it home, right? Like somehow it's got to get to you. And a lot of people are moving away from plastic, which is awesome. In fact, there's a lot of countries, that are banning plastic as well. But what are they using? What are they turning to? And are these alternatives better? Well, as you've probably noticed from this talk, the answers are not quite as straightforward as we thought. But let's take a look at some of the things that are being substituted. So there's three new types of plastic out there. And the first one's called renewable or bioplastics. These are made from plants and other biomass, so corn, wood, fiber, sugarcane. They can even be upcycled from like wood and food waste. They don't require fossil fuels to be made, so there's no petroleum involved, and they do have a smaller carbon footprint than normal plastic. But despite the hopeful name, renewable and bioplastics still have a really long shelf life. And there's no guarantee that they will biodegrade because we actually need really high temperatures to make sure that they break down. And if they end up in a body of water, they can definitely cause the same amount of damage that regular plastics do, because they won't break down unless they're subjected to very high temperatures. So while their name sounds great and their production method is a little greener, they, will probably still be piling up intact in landfills hundreds of years from now if they're not disposed of in the right fashion. The second category of plastics that we've seen recently is biodegradable plastics. Now, these are able to be broken down with the help of microorganisms. So if you have some bacteria or fungi or algae, they can be broken down, but there's no regulations around how long it takes for them to break down. And another problem is that while these are coming into play and you're starting to see these around the world, the waste management companies around the world are seldom equipped with the proper conditions to provide these plastics to be able to biodegrade. In fact, it's so rare for a refuse company to have the proper conditions that California has now banned the term biodegradable for plastics sold in the state. And since they have no strict time limit on breaking down or a really accessible framework for waste management, they're probably also going to be around for many, many moons. And I think the term biodegradable plastic is more of a misnomer than it is a solution. But if you're looking for plastics that will eventually disappear, look for compostable plastic. Certified compostable plastic is held to very high standards in testing. And it actually does break down without a bunch of harmful byproducts. So there's an organization called ASTM, which I don't remember what that stands for, but these guys define compostable plastics as being able to break down completely in aerobic, municipal, or industrial composting facilities and within a set amount of time. Also, these plastics should not leave a toxic or visual residue. So the Biodegradable Products Institute, also known as BPI, has taken this definition a step further and created a certification for compostable plastic. So all you need to worry about is looking for that little BPI insignia on the plastics that you have. And if you see that BPI stamp, then you know it's compostable. So this is by far the best of the three if you're going to start substituting out your regular plastic for something new. But you definitely still want to double check with your waste management system and make sure that they accept compostable plastics and have the facilities to be able to break those down. Okay, but what about paper? So paper bags were once hailed as this answer to plastic bags, and people started switching them out in grocery stores, paying an extra 10 cents for them, and using them all the time. They decompose, they're made from natural sources, and they just look a lot, they don't look like they're going to harm the environment as much, so which is great. However, there was a report that came out from the UK's Environment Agency that kind of threw some shade on this eco-ness of paper bags. It noted that you would have to use a paper bag 4 times before it equaled the environmental impact that it takes to make one plastic bag. Now, they consider things like the weight of the bags, shipping the bags, the weight of the bags during shipping, the durability of the bags, because paper bags tend to tear, and also the materials being used, right? These are made of trees, essentially. And even worse, cotton-based reusable bags would have to be used over 131 times to be equivalent to the production of one plastic bag. So if you're deciding to switch to paper or cotton bags, just be sure you use them as many times as possible. And what about paper food packaging? Well, paper and cardboard are standard, right, for takeout these days. Nobody wants to be seen with styrofoam, right? And from an environmental standpoint, they are a much better option than styrofoam and much more sustainable than plastic. But a lot of them are actually lined with a plastic resin to keep them from leaking. And when this happens, it's actually unlikely that that paper food packaging can be recycled. So it's a good idea just to double check with your waste management company and see if they can be recycled, because a lot of times they just can't. So to recap, you should definitely look for compostable plastic over the alternatives. Reuse your paper or cotton bags as much as you can. And then check with your local waste management company on what types of plastic or paper they take or recycle. And then I've just got one more slide here that goes through all of the solutions that we talked about today. And we'll just go through them real fast. I'll go through them real fast. Don't go overboard with food trends. Eat a little, then see how your body reacts. Buy organic from trusted farmers. Question. Research farms. Not everybody can afford the organic label, but they're still using organic practices sometimes. Wash and cook your food. Look for regenerative ag. Choose compostable plastic over the alternatives. Reuse your paper or cotton bags as much as you can. And check with your local waste management company on what types of plastics and paper they take or recycle. So I hope this helps and gives you a couple tangible things to do the next time you're at the grocery store and the next time you're thinking about, taking food home. And yeah, I just want to thank you so much for having me on Awareness Wednesday.
Thank you for joining us. You've given us a lot to think about. I of course have some more questions.
Yeah,
so,
of course.
Now I'm thinking about takeout containers with that lining. So if it's not recyclable, would a paper container with the lining, would it still biodegrade faster than something that was styrofoam or plastic? Like, is it still a better option?
Question. So I don't know the scientific answer, but I would say a logical answer is yes. Unfortunately, it's going to not be able to go inside the compostable or the recyclable trash bin if you have those. So it would just go in regular trash. But because it's made from paper primarily, it is going to break down faster than styrofoam for sure. Styrofoam is going to be with us for a very long time.
Like we don't even know, like with plastics and styrofoam, we don't even really know how long it takes for that to completely biodegrade, right? Because like I read something that said every piece of plastic ever made still exists.
Yeah, I mean, unless it's incinerated and then, that's just going into the air.
Yeah, which, that's got to be good for us. So, and that, it just makes me, everything's really a toss-up at this point, right? Because I think like we live in a world now where anything can be delivered to you. And so I always go back and forth on, is it more sustainable for me to order things online and have them delivered to me than it is to go out and buy them? Like, what's the impact there? There's just so much to think about. And then on plastic bags versus paper bags, I know some recycling facilities, those the plastic bags jam the machines, so it's a lot harder to recycle those. So then you go back and forth on, it's harder to make a paper bag, but it will disappear at some point,
right?
Versus the plastic that never will. So I really appreciate you taking the time to share all of this with us, because I think it really does point out how much there is to think about. And you just have to, like, having all of this information is so important so that you can make a decision and just know that there are going to be pros and cons to everything. And, we just all do the best you can until you know better and then do better, right?
Yeah, exactly. You can't obsess over this stuff, and really what I try to do is provide both sides of it. Like I obviously have an opinion, but like I try to keep that out of it. So that way, people do see that, even if they're trying really hard, that and to be environmental or this and that, it's not all for naught, right? But sometimes you can try really hard and it's just misinformation, There's a term called wish cycling that I heard of last year. It's like when you throw things in the recycling bin that you think are recyclable, but your company, your waste management company doesn't actually recycle them. But you think you're doing the right thing because of course it's recyclable, or like maybe they require you to, rinse out your glass containers or your food containers, right? And then you just forget, so you just throw it in there, but it's like, it's not actually gonna get recycled.
Yeah, so true. Well, thank you. This has been great. And so Evolve.ag, you're also on Twitter and Instagram. You've got a great blog. I haven't listened to the podcast yet. I'm going to do that
Oh,
next.
check out the podcast. It's on
Um,
Spotify. It's on Apple Podcasts. It's on all the
okay.
big ones.
Okay.
We only have a couple episodes. I just kicked it off this in January, so
Oh, okay. That's
there's only a few
exciting.
episodes, but they're cool. We interviewed Turtle Tree Labs in Singapore, which are making lab grown milk.
Wow.
And then there's another one about food trends for 2020 on there. And then there's going to be a really cool one about vertical farming, a vertical farm in Hawaii coming up soon. So that's the next one
Cool.
we're going to release in about a week. So
That's exciting. So lots of great stuff coming from Wendy and Evolve.ag. And thank you for joining us today. If there are organizations or people or ideas that you think are making the world a better place and you want us to feature them on Awareness Wednesday, let us know. You can find us here on Facebook. Just send us a message, or there's a contact form on our website. So just shoot us a line, let us know. And then if there's more you want to hear from Wendy, let us know too, or you can reach out to her directly. Wendy, thank you for joining us today.
oh my gosh, thank you so much for having me. Yeah, and I took the slide down, but info@evolve.ag, or you can just go to the website and my contact info is on there too. So thanks so much. This was really great. I hope everybody's
Yes.
doing something and, be happy about the way the world's going. Don't be sad.
Don't
Everything's
be
great.
sad. Don't worry, be happy.
That's right.
Thank you, Wendy. Everybody have a great Wednesday, and we will see you next time.